Hi everyone, Simon here from Reld. We're going to talk to you today about one of the most controversial topics and probably most misunderstood with the rural properties that we deal with, which is occupancy clauses. The difference that it can make in actually achieving a sale, selling a property for a good price, saving money on a move is quite substantial. Occupancy clauses can come in a variety of forms, and we'll go through some of those in a second. But essentially, what an occupancy clause is a planning restriction. And it's a restriction on who can occupy a property, not who can buy it. So the misconception usually is, can I actually buy a property with an occupancy clause? And the answer is always yes, of course, anybody can. But whether you can occupy it or not will depend. And somebody would say, well, why would we buy a property that we can't live in? Well, it'll become clear in a second. But ultimately, there are workarounds, there are changes in planning that you can have. The wording of the clause is really important. So what we're going to do, we're going to show you three properties, three properties clauses rather, and we can explain the difference between them and who that may mean that it's accessible for. Typically, people would always think that an occupancy clause, particularly an agricultural occupancy clause, is somebody who was last or currently working in agriculture or forestry, or a widow or a dependent of such person. And that is true in some cases, but not all cases. So if I share with you, I'll just check that everything's working. If I share with you my screen, I'm going to give you access to a property that we've currently got on the market. And I'm going to show you the difference that it makes. So this property has got an occupancy clause on it. You can see here on the planning document, typically on the planning portal, in terms of where you would access this information. We'll come on to some of the older ones that pre-existed the planning portal a little bit later. But you can see here that contrary to what I've just said about what a typical occupancy clause would be or what people would perceive it to be, this is very clear in its terms. The occupation of the dwelling house hereby approved shall be limited to a person who both owns and manages the free-range poultry business at X property, or a widower or a widow of such person, and to any resident dependents. Now, what that means in real terms is somebody's got to be working within and managing that business, which is totally different to what most people would think an occupancy clause is for the traditional agricultural occupancy clause. And that's why understanding the wording and making it relevant to you is really important. So in that example, it doesn't say that it has to be your main income. It doesn't say that it has to be your sole income. It doesn't say the breadth of the poultry business. And therefore, is it reasonable to assume that more people could occupy that property even by just ticking the business over? And that's a question that you'll have to consider for yourself. Ultimately, with any occupancy clause, it's the local authority who enforce the issue because they're a planning authority, it's a planning regulation. But what they do have to do is they have to make sure that they've given you an opportunity to comply with the clause prior to taking enforcement action. If you're buying a property, then what you could be wise doing is speaking to local authorities planning department, explaining the occupancy clause, tying it back to your situation and making sure that you can comply ultimately. However, I personally have had a number of conversations with people in the local authority, in the planning departments, and because they don't exactly have a list of here's all of the properties that have got occupancy clauses on them, it creates great difficulty. And quite often they won't give probably the right advice and the right interpretation, which makes it a little bit more challenging. Now, another example that I'll show you is a property that we dealt with a year or two ago, and they had great difficulty navigating the occupancy clause for the reasons that I've set out, the understanding, the lending elements to it. But actually, when you boiled it down to the sum of its parts, it wasn't anywhere near what people thought it would be. So this property here, it's on the local authority's website. The occupation of the dwelling hereby approved shall be limited to a person involved in the active day-to-day management, supervision, and operation of an agricultural or equestrian commercial business operating from the site within the ownership area showed on the plan referenced, or a person solely or mainly working or last working at an agricultural or equestrian commercial business operating from the site within the ownership area. Obviously, there's a plan that goes with this, or a widow or widow of such a person, and to any resident dependents. Now, forget the reason, because it doesn't matter, it's the local authority. They're the ones who are deviating or allowing somebody to go there or occupy. But if you think to the looseness of that wording, essentially what it's saying is, if you're involved in an agricultural or equestrian business from this site, then you qualify for the occupancy clause. And therefore, what is classed as you running an agricultural or equestrian business? Is it selling an egg? Is it having a livery or a DIY? Is it having a rug washing business? And you can see how that loose wording would mean that virtually any agricultural or equestrian business for that particular property would have been complying with the clause. Never mind the people who would have been there before or dependents and things like that. So it's a drastic change and much more inclusive than your traditional agricultural occupancy clause. Now, I'll give you another example of a property that's on the market with us at the moment. It has an open day this weekend, and this one's in Wales, and Wales have slightly different systems in place. So they do still have the agricultural occupancy clause that we've referred to already, which is last working or solely or mainly employed in agriculture. However, what they also have is a much more modern version, which is referred to as a rural enterprise restriction. And you can call that or refer back to the TAN 6 guidance. So on this particular property, you can see that this is a person solely or mainly working or last working on a rural enterprise in the locality, or a widow or surviving civil partner, etc., etc., etc. Now, rural enterprise in Wales comes under the umbrella of so many rural businesses. And again, it's going to be specific to the individual and their circumstances, but it could be agriculture, it could be farming, it could be smallholding, it could be breeding, it could be livery, it could be an equestrian centre, it could be horticultural, it could be camping and glamping, it could be a fishery, it could be so many different things that effectively it would be easier to refer to it as, if you've got a business that uses the land or uses the buildings, essentially. While that's a very loose term, it means that if it's a rural enterprise restriction, that you've got a very good chance, if you run a rural business of some capacity or are planning to, of being able to qualify. Part of the occupancy restriction can also be last working or in the locality. And again, that's a quite an ambiguous phrase. You would make the argument that once you're in the property, you're in the locality, and therefore it's about getting there, and then you'd be qualifying for it as well. The advice over the rural enterprise for the Welsh system is available if you want to Google or search TAN 6. And again, as I say, it's much more inclusive. What you're looking for is this document here, and you can see how it is effectively planning for sustainable rural communities, i.e. planning for the relevant use of the land and the buildings. And if you start looking at section 3 and section 4, you can see here some of the elements that are incorporated into that. the reuse and adaptation of rural buildings, agricultural buildings, residential conversions of buildings, holiday conversions, farm diversifications, farm shops, farm plans. And it does go further to talk about the affordable elements. It goes on to talk about the equestrian elements of rural enterprise. So it does go into quite a lot of detail. But if you're not sure, then again, speak to the local authority, because they're ultimately the ones who are going to be making the decision for you. Now, occupancy clauses can be difficult to spot. And depending where you are, whether you're England or Wales, if there's anything that's been built from the 1940s onwards and it's in a rural spot, there is a possibility that it could have, in particular, an agricultural occupancy clause. So it's always good to ask the agents involved if it looks like it stands by itself. Some of the older ones are really difficult to track down now, and only a historic planning search during the conveyance may reveal it. And most people don't have that done. So there are examples where people have bought properties not knowing there hasn't been an occupancy clause on it because they haven't done the historic planning search. And when they come to sell, the next buyer does do that, and it reveals that there is an occupancy clause there, which obviously is not very good. As a general rule, if you see something 60s, 70s onwards, certainly it's what I would do. I ask every time pretty much that we're going to a property unless it's really obvious that it wouldn't have one. But if it's 16s, 70s onwards, and it looks like it's been added to a farm or it sits by itself or something like that, that's when I'd be seriously asking the question. Agents, if they are aware, do have an obligation to tell you that an occupancy clause exists. However, a lot of agents won't know where to find that information from. And a lot of them I've seen, not all obviously, and it's typically people who maybe don't deal with rural properties as often. They have advertised, effectively, they've gone to Google and got the wording for an occupancy clause, which is agricultural, farming, forestry, or dependent of. When you've looked at the paperwork, because you've been able to find out, that's not correct, and it's much more inclusive than what you would have thought. A question that we get asked a lot about occupancy clauses, and there are various types: equestrian, horticultural, agricultural, business, local occupancy clauses. They're age restricted, so you might see particularly apartments these days that are 55 plus. So there can be a variety of occupancy clauses, but we get asked, does it devalue a property? And the answer is yes, it does. How much it devalues a property will depend ultimately on what the clause says. If you think of it as a restriction, then anytime you restrict a potential buyer and you reduce your buyer pool, that's likely to have an adverse impact on value. From a surveyor's point of view, if we assume the worst or most restrictive type of occupancy clause, they can devalue a property from its open market value by around 30%. And there aren't really many that would go past that. If you look at some of the examples that we've given you, if they're more inclusive, will it impact the value? Yes. But will it impact it a lot? No, because a lot of people can buy it anyway. And the example that we gave you, where any agricultural or any equestrian business, particularly on a holding of that size, it was pretty much every buyer would be doing that anyway. Another question we get asked a lot is, does it affect lending? And the answer is yes, it can affect lending. If you're buying a property cash, whether you comply or not, that's down to you. That's your risk to take. But if you're interested in an occupancy clause and it does have that restriction and you are getting lending, then it's no longer just your decision, the local authority's decision and the seller's decision. The lender will want to make sure that you have got the right to reside in the property, especially if you're getting a residential mortgage. And therefore, they will want to see your compliance with the clause, whether it's ingoing, as in you're already complying with the clause, and when you get in there, you continue complying with it. Or if you've got a business plan, for example, and you're going to start a business from the property, that will affect whether you get a residential or commercial mortgage as well. There are workarounds depending on the clause itself and the wording. So there are quite a few people who may buy the property cash and buy the land with finance, so that the lender isn't particularly bothered about the house anymore, and you can work it that way. You can go for a specialist mortgage product as well. There's a few good brokers who deal with that. There is Ben at Wall to Wall Finance. The link is there on the description. They've got a part on their website that's specific to occupancy clause mortgages. And then you've got Linda of Equine and Rural. They also can help with lending on just land. So in the example I've just given, both of those are generally good for more complicated mortgages for properties with land anyway. And obviously both can help with occupancy clause style mortgages. Now, when it comes to contextualizing any advice, everybody's situation is different. So it's really hard to do one video that will explain everything that you need to do. But what we have done is we've written 12, 15 guides just on occupancy clauses. They're free to access on our website. So by all means, go and have a look. I think finally, the last question that we get asked is, can these occupancy clauses be lifted? And the answer is yes, they can. They can be difficult to lift, and it depends on the scenario, but I will run through a few with you. So if we have the knowledge that an occupancy clause is just a planning restriction, any planning policy that is not complied with for a period of time can obtain a certificate of lawfulness, which effectively means, yes, this planning restriction is in place, or you're in breach of planning rather, but you've been in breach of planning for so long that we're now going to give you a certificate, a piece of paper, that effectively says we're not going to take any enforcement action against you. That doesn't lift the clause. It's important to remember that. But it does mean that you can live there legally without complying with the clause. What most people would do is they would also, as part of that process, lift the occupancy clause to say, well, if I can live here without it, then you don't need it anymore, and do it that way, which is great. Another way of lifting the clause would be to demonstrate that there's no market demand. So a lot of these properties exist. Some of them have locality elements. A lot of them have business connotations. These exist in such a way that if you can prove that you have tried to reach everybody who could comply with the clause, and you can't sell the property, for argument's sake, because nobody can comply or whatever it may be, if you can demonstrate that to a local authority, you can make a planning application to have it removed. Each planning authority, I'm sure, will give you different advice, but as a general rule, most people will be looking to have it on the market for 6 to 9 months and to demonstrate that everything possible has been done. You can't just advertise at any old price. It needs to be at a price reflective of what the true market value is with the occupancy clause. But other than that, you're all right. You don't have to go out there and market so extensively that you've spoke to every person in the country. As long as you've made a reasonable effort, the local authority have to take that into account. There are a few other ways, so you could just speculatively try and get it lifted, just like any planning application, but it's very rarely successful. And a really good one is a deviation of the occupancy clause. So if it is just restricted to agricultural, for argument's sake, you may choose to make an application to deviate that to also incorporate equestrian, horticultural, or anything else that you want to do, really. I think that is a very quick run through of occupancy clauses. I'm sure there'll be people with questions. So if you want to ask anything specific or you want me to contextualize for your situation, just put something in the comments and I'll answer. Got a question here from Ashley. Is that part of the council? What do you mean? Did you mean the the documentation where we found what the restriction was, if you're still there. I'll assume that's what you mean. Yes. So as it's the council who put the restrictions in place, it should be on the council's paperwork, on any decision paperwork, just like any other conditions or covenants that they may wish to place. Quite often it's in one of the first 4 sections, usually under the section 106. So if somebody says that there's a section 106 on a property, that's usually what they mean. There's an occupancy clause. And yes, you can find that for anything a bit more recent on the local authority website. But as referred to earlier, if they are older or it's been lost in transit with a local authority, then a historic planning search really is your only way to go. Whether you choose to do that or not is entirely up to you. What I would suggest is, and unless somebody's here from the local authority tells me otherwise, it's not like there's a big list in the office at the local authority that says all of these properties, all of these have got an occupancy clause. Let's go and knock on the door every week and see what's going on. It's a good question, Ryan. Does just one person in the household need to comply? Depends on the wording, and it depends on how you're buying, because obviously if you're buying it cash, if you're buying it mortgage, some of it will come down to your mortgage rather than the actual local authority themselves. But usually, yeah, if there's a couple of you and one of you is working and the wording is solely or mainly employed, then yeah, that should work. Elizabeth, yes, you'll be able to watch it. It'll go back on our social media page, so you'll be able to have a look, share it around. But we have also got the advice guides on our website. So if you don't want to listen to me, then you are more than welcome to go on there. I'll put the banner up in a second. But if you've got a question to ask, I don't mind answering it. So that's where the link is on our website, relproperty.com, category advice guides, occupancy clauses. You can have a look there. And Corley, what if someone started a business but fell ill and couldn't continue with it? Again, there's such a range of variables, but once you've bought the property and you are occupying it, the only time that you'll ever fall foul of that occupancy restriction at that point, once you've acquired it, let's assume that you had a business, you acquired it with that business, you then couldn't continue working in that business. Technically, it depends how long you've been there really, but you could be in breach of planning, because if the planning says that you should be running X, Y, and Z, and that business no longer exists, then yes, you could fall foul. However, quite a lot of these would say last working in, and the last working in element would be a good stopgap and a good fallback for you, really. But even then, even if none of that was relevant, I'll not say that actually. You'd be relying on the local authority coming and knocking on your door and saying you should be complying with this clause, and then them taking enforcement action. But before it got that far, they'd have to give you an opportunity to comply with the clause. You'd explain your situation, and I would think you'd be fine. I couldn't say that for certain without the exact situation, but it's very unlikely that something would happen out the back of that. Are the rules in Scotland any different to England and Wales? The Scottish system is totally different anyway. So they have things like crofts, for example, which are totally different. You've got farms that are totally different. I'll be honest, I haven't really dealt with occupancy clauses in Scotland. Somebody'd have to tell me if they exist. Technically, I guess they could, because it's a planning restriction and the local authority can restrict anything. But the wording is, or would be, critical in any occupancy clause. So a good understanding of the wording on any occupancy clause will help work it through. But again, as they're planning restrictions, you'd speak to the local authority. But there are different rules in England and Wales. The big difference between England and Wales is the modern approach in Wales is now a rural enterprise dwelling, which factors in a range of businesses, whereas the standard go-to in England may be an agricultural one. So your more restrictive agricultural forestry, and then applying for deviations. So yeah, there are slight differences in planning policies and frameworks between England and Wales, but I haven't really dealt with an occupancy clause in Scotland, to be honest. Should you do the council AOC queries after or before making an offer on the property? What would the vendor expect? It's a good question, Judy. Very good question, actually. My expectation as an agent would be that I would be telling you what the occupancy clause is if I know, or at least telling you how to find it. And therefore, the vendor's expectation would usually be that I've done my job and we've had a conversation, and that you either comply with the clause or believe that you can comply with the clause. From a personal point of view, if you were worried whether you did or you didn't, and you were to speak to the local authority, you'd want to do it prior, realistically, because you're not going to make an offer if you know you can't comply with the clause, or you've got no chance of complying with the clause, or you're not going to risk it for the clause. If you think that there's still an opportunity, then that's when you would be making your offer. And again, what I would suggest is us as an agent and agents' good practice, if we were aware of an occupancy clause, we would want to have either sufficient confidence or a reasonable degree of confidence that you can comply with the clause before we'd accept an offer. Does that come in a tangible format of, here you go, here's a piece of paper from the local authority? No. And as we explained earlier, it depends on who you're going to get at the local authority that sits at the planning desk, because they might not know, might not be that experienced in it themselves. But I think as a vendor, as a seller of a property, you would expect that somebody coming through your door would have a reasonable understanding of the clause, have a reasonable solution for the clause, and if making an offer, they'd be making an offer on the basis that they're aware of the clause. So I would ask the question back to you, Judy. If you was upfront with everything and the buyer or potential buyer knew everything in advance, would you be disappointed if that sale then collapsed because it turned out after all they couldn't comply with the clause? I would suggest that you probably would. So expectation would be that you would know, but to be honest, not that many people will speak to the local authority to get advice on it. Most people will either know if they would or they wouldn't. And even if they don't know, because a lot of people buy with a mortgage, the mortgage company would know if they're going to give them a mortgage based on an occupancy clause mortgage anyway. So it kind of sorts itself out in most cases. Oh, after Piscal's equestrian was a doggy daycare, which kind of be able to lift the equestrian clause. Wendy, the short answer is yes. You can always try and lift the clause. It depends on the justification on how you're going to do it. So I think your argument here is that it's an equestrian property that also has a doggy daycare, and the local authority have either given consent or are happy that the doggy daycare exists. So I think the argument that you're trying to make is, well, that's not equestrian, and therefore they accept other uses that aren't just equestrian, and therefore can I lift it on that basis? The short answer to that is no. If you've still been complying with the equestrian element, they will argue that, well, you've still been complying with that, we'll just let you do something else with it as well. Applying to deviate the tie, yep, do that. If you've been in breach of the equestrian element of the clause, I'm not saying that you have or you haven't, then you can make an application for a certificate of lawfulness, but usually it's a 10-year period. I would suggest that with a better understanding of your circumstances, it would be probably beneficial to either amend or deviate the tie, or have a word with the local authority to say, look, you've got this occupancy clause. You're clearly not that bothered about this occupancy clause because I've had a doggy daycare for forever and a day. It's going to restrict my opportunity for selling, and therefore, can we just lift the tie? That would be one of the exceptions that we referred to earlier of what I would call a speculative application. And as far as opportunities go, that'd be a good one. It'd be a good one to have a go at. I meant fell ill. Yeah, I think I kind of assumed that you meant that you were farming, for example. You had the business, you complied with the clause, you then fell ill and could no longer run your business. I think that's kind of what you're referring to, right? And therefore, you would be again looking back on the wording of the clause, but as most people would say, solely or mainly or last employed in X, you would be ticking the last employed box in that scenario, so you should be fine. If the wording was a little bit more obtuse, if it was a little bit more challenging, just an explanation with a local authority. I can't imagine any reasonable local authority having an occupancy clause on a property that you did comply with when you went in, which is the main time for these things to be flagged. And then you're in a difficult situation with illness or family or something like that. I think it'd be very unreasonable of the local authority to try and take enforcement action. And as I said earlier, even if that was their intention, which I can't think it would be, they've still got to give you an opportunity to comply anyway. And I can't imagine them taking enforcement action to remove you from a property if you fell ill, which has meant that you can't continue your business permanently or at the moment. Wendy, depends on the wording of the clause, but based on what you've said, the 10 years would have passed that you would have been in breach of planning, which is kind of what you're saying, right? That you've not complied with the clause for 15 years. In which case, yes, you can make an application for a certificate of lawful use because you've been in breach of planning for that length of time, and follow that quickly with a lifting of the agricultural or equestrian occupancy clause. Yeah, it's equestrian, isn't it? So yeah, that'd be worthwhile looking into. Hoping to start a charity, would this be sufficient as a business? It's sufficient as a business, but it depends on the wording of the clause again. Again, all of this will revolve around the wording of the clause. So in that scenario, I don't know if you're getting a mortgage or not, but let's assume that you're buying it cash. As a general rule, guys, if you're buying it cash, move in there, do what you want. It's at your risk that the local authority come knocking on your door. But if you're buying it with a mortgage, that presents different challenges. So if you're hoping to start a charity and you're looking at a mortgage to go and buy a property with an occupancy clause, the mortgage company will want to know that you satisfy the needs of that occupancy clause. But would a charity operating, charity is still a business, would a charity operating on site that meets the needs of the clause? I think a good example here might be, let's assume there's an equestrian occupancy clause and you set up a therapy type business that revolves around equine therapy. That'll be a really good example. Most of those type of businesses tend to be charitable, but yes, you'd be occupying the property on the basis that you're employed in that business, and I don't know what wage you'd be taking or how you would structure it, but in that situation, it should do. But it's not just the local authority. If you get in a lender, it's the lender who also has to agree, and they'd have to agree with a business plan for the charity as a business, and making sure that you can get paid sufficiently from that charity as a business to cover the mortgage. Am I aware of any cases where anyone has been evicted? Yes. More commonly in rentals. So there are a lot of farmers, for example, who will have a lot of property over a lot of land sites, and they'll be aware that a property has an occupancy clause on it, but they have rented it out to a tenant who doesn't meet the needs of that occupancy clause. and that has caused a number of issues, potential evictions, depending on if lenders are involved on those properties. There could be in breach of the mortgage as well. So the short answer is yes, it has happened. Judy, cool, no worries. Is there anything else that anybody wants to ask? It's a complicated subject, but if you can get that wording down, that's the main starting point. You get that wording down, you can work around it. But without that wording, you're always making assumptions that might not be right. Anybody else got any more questions? Cool, no worries. So I'll just put the link back in here. So again, if you're looking for an occupancy clause, Ben at Wall to Wall Finance can help there with the mortgage for an occupancy clause. And you've also got Linda at Equine and Rural. Both of those can help you have a chat through. And if you're looking for more specific advice, there's around 12 to 15 guides on lifting the clauses, deviating them, anything in particular on our website, grellproperty.com. There's also a range of other guides there regarding covenants, things that you can do to make your moves easier, a variety of different things. Rebecca, you're more qualified than me to say that. You know what you're talking about, I'm sure. Don't need a refresher. Cool. Right. Thank you, everyone. If you want us to do another guide on anything in particular, just let us know in the comments or let us know on our page. And if we get enough people who think it'll be useful, then we'll do a guide on it for you. Thank you, and I'll see you later.